Sanson of Louisiana State University in Alexandria, who's going to talk to us about the Louisiana Purchase and admission to the Union, Louisiana admission to the Union. Few would argue that Thomas Jefferson's most consequential legacy as president was the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States in a blue light special and secured vital river outlets to the Gulf of Mexico, in particular the port of New Orleans. But Jefferson's bargain did not come without controversy. The acquisition of Louisiana put Jefferson in a bind over constitutional interpretation. Jefferson had been a vocal advocate of strict construction of the Constitution, but the Constitution gave the executive no specific power to acquire territory. So he convinced himself that the power to make treaties implied the power to acquire territory, and in the process provided an early and important lesson in constitutional governance, and a topic that is as current today as it was in 1803. Dr. Sanson will provide us with insight into the struggles of law, conscience, and politics surrounding the Louisiana Purchase and the further debates it sparked over Louisiana statehood in his paper, Louisiana, the Purchase and Admission to the Union, Constitutional Issues in the Early Republic. And Dr. Sanson earned his PhD in history from Louisiana State University and is currently professor of history and political science and chair of the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences at LSU Alexandria. He's a former president of the Louisiana Historical Association and a fellow of that organization. He's editor of Camp Beauregard and Central Louisiana and author of 3 other books, Louisiana State and Local Government, Louisiana During World War II, and Louisiana State University in Alexandria 1960 to 2010. And some of the interesting things that he's done, in addition to numerous articles and essays and encyclopedia entries on Louisiana history, is a feature segment on the Travel Channel series Mysteries at the Museum. Dr. Sanson.
Thank you. And I might add that I was not the museum piece, that we got a document, an original document related to Solomon Northup's quest for freedom in the LSUA archives. So that was the mystery of the museum. But nevertheless, President Thomas Jefferson received stunning news on July 3rd, 1803. His ambassador in France, Robert Livingston, assisted by Special Envoy James Monroe, had achieved a land acquisition of historic proportions that approximately doubled the size of the country by negotiating the Louisiana Purchase Treaty and the accompanying documents, which were dated April 30th, 1803. You studied that episode, you know that the documents were not actually approved until early May, but France and the United States both agreed to recognize April 30th. Those documents arrived in Washington on July 14th, and Jefferson presented them to his cabinet officers for their advice on July 16th. He revealed his conflicted concern about the legality of the purchase. A very early acquisition of Louisiana offered tempting opportunities, but Jefferson's strict interpretation of constitutional powers didn't allow the federal government to acquire territory of the magnitude encompassed by Louisiana. Jefferson's solution to the problem was to amend the Constitution and expressly legalize an action that had already been completed. We will be obliged to ask from the people an amendment to the Constitution, authorizing their receiving the province into the Union, providing for its government, he said, except, as I tell my students, it's the excepts and howevers that always make history interesting. Except Napoleon Bonaparte had insisted that the treaty must be ratified no later than 6 months from the time it was signed, that is by October 30th, 1803, and that the entire transfer must be completed by the end of the year. By that, mainly he meant you will be in control and we'll have our money. Right? Jefferson's advisors sought alternative ways. They don't have time to amend the Constitution to justify the acquisition within the scope of powers allowed by the president's strict constructionism. Attorney General Levi Lincoln advised Jefferson to justify the purchase by adding the territory to an existing territory or state. This approach, he said, will comply with the spirit of strict construction because it implies only that an existing territory is being enlarged. Secretary of the Treasury Alvin Gallatin, however, prepared a report to the president on this issue that established a constitutional doctrine that allowed the United States to acquire territory ultimately all the way to the Pacific. Gallatin argued that, in his words, the existence of the United States as a nation presupposes the power enjoyed by every nation of extending their own territory by treaties, and the general power given to the President and Senate of making treaties designates the organs through which the acquisition may be made. Gallatin was absolutely right according to the Declaration of Independence. You've all read it, I'm sure. You remember the words. The United States can do all sorts of things. Levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Acquired territory is one of those, Gallatin said. Well, unfortunately for Jefferson, Declaration of Independence is important, but it's the Constitution and its requirements that he has to meet. Gallatin urged the president to reach the goal of claiming Louisiana by saying that the purchase was simply an incidental part of a treaty with France. The Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, clearly granted presidential authority to negotiate treaties as part of the executive branch's power to conduct foreign relations, and to the United States Senate the power to ratify those treaties. Therefore, the purchase could be justified, strict construction upheld, both at the same time. Jefferson initially seemed to support Gallatin's idea, but by late summer began to retreat from his position, reiterating his belief that amending the Constitution was a far safer route to enlarging the country. Jefferson decided finally that constitutional concerns could not stand in the way of virtually doubling the size of the country without shedding a single drop of red American blood. He accepted Gallatin's argument and dropped the idea of adding an amendment to the Constitution. Even then, his concerns about loose construction bothered him. His faith in the essential soundness of the American character, however, helped to allay those doubts, which he still harbored. He maintained that the good sense of our country, as he described it, would correct the evils of loose construction when it shall produce evil effects, he said. Not incidentally, he also assumed that the people approved of such expansion, and therefore Louisiana's acquisition would strengthen his party and his administration. Jefferson was wise to consider the political fallout that might accrue to his party. The opposing political party, the Federalists, used the proposal to buy Louisiana as an opportunity to berate Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans. One New England Federalist commented that the cession of Louisiana is an excellent thing for France. It is like selling us a ship after she is surrounded by a British fleet. New England Federalist leader Fisher Ames commented pointedly that Louisiana is a great waste, a wilderness, unpeopled with any beings except wolves and wandering Indians. We are to give money of which we have too little for land of which we already have too much. Another Federalist feared that the Republic's expanding boundaries would only withstand a limited amount of pressure before bursting at the seams. Our empire is growing unwieldy, wrote Jedediah Morse, and must, I think, ere long break into pieces. Somberly, he added the comment, something the sooner the better. Senator John C. Breckinridge supplied the Democratic-Republican answer to that concern, commenting about the United States that, I believe, that the more extensive its dominions, the more safe and durable it will be. Other critics maintained that the country risked national bankruptcy to buy a desert. Federalists pointed out in debate that the approximately $15 million needed to meet France's price for Louisiana equaled 432 tons of pure silver. In another unit of measure, easily understood by virtually every American in the early 19th century, they observed that the amount of silver required to buy Louisiana would fill 866 wagons. Right? Most Americans in the early 19th century, or today, would have difficulty envisioning what 433 tons of silver looked like. They knew what a wagon would hold. Federalists dallying on this issue caused additional complications in the delicate negotiations. Ambassador Livingston reported to Jefferson in late August 1803 that Napoleon was considering revoking his ratification of the Louisiana documents. "We must act quickly," Livingston wrote. "Be persuaded that France is sick of the bargain, that Spain is much dissatisfied, and that the slightest pretense will lose you the treaty." Even after the Senate ratified the Louisiana Purchase Treaty on October 20th, 1803, Federalist Representative Roger Griswold of Connecticut attempted to derail the purchase on October 24th, when he raised the question of whether or not France had complied with all terms of the Treaty of San Ildefonso, by which Spain retroceded the colony, and thus whether France had established a clear title to Louisiana, which it could transfer to the United States. The treaty between the United States and the French government does not ascertain whether those terms have been complied with by France, or whether the cession has actually been made by Spain to France, Griswold commented in debate. The remedy for the situation, according to Griswold, was for the United States government to obtain a copy of the Treaty of San Ildefonso and any documents generated by the Spanish government ceding Louisiana to France in order to satisfy Federalist concerns about the legality of the title. Griswold's stratagem would have demanded that the executive branch produce documents which might require months at best to acquire, and then only if the French and Spanish governments chose to reply to its request for information. By raising this issue in late October, in a process that had to be completed by December 31st, Griswold evidently hoped to delay the proceedings until the country exceeded Napoleon's December 31st deadline, thus nullifying the entire enterprise. Congress rejected his effort. Then, Federalists raised another constitutional argument. November 3rd, 1803, Senator Timothy Pickering of Massachusetts mounted a last-ditch Federalist effort to stop the purchase when he rose to speak in debate over the bill that authorized the bonds to pay for Louisiana. Pickering's service to the country, dating back to his days as George Washington's Secretary of State, lent gravity to his words as he explained the Federalist case for denying the strange land entry into the majestic Union. He argued that under normal circumstances, Congress must pass the necessary legislation to support the terms of a treaty that it had ratified. This case, however, seemed different to him. The technicality, Pickering thought, was the requirement contained in the treaty that the colony should be incorporated into the Union. The only way that he saw by which such an arrangement could be completed, and a foreign country, as he described it, admitted as an associate of the Union, as he described it, was by obtaining the assent of each individual state. Business-minded Federalists envisioned the country structured as a commercial enterprise. Therefore, Pickering maintained, quote, the consent of each member would be necessary to admit a new partner into the company. By emphasizing each state's role in making the decision, Federalists abandoned their traditional vision of the Constitution, granting significant powers to the federal government. But then, so had the Jeffersonians in Congress abandoned their earlier principles that emphasized states' rights at the expense of the federal government. Several congressmen counter-argued that the Federalist position granted too much authority to the states and that the federal government possessed adequate power to complete the transaction. It's only a coincidence if you're hearing the strains of the world turned upside down at this point in my presentation, or to put it another way, the president and his supporters were using Hamiltonian means to secure Jeffersonian ends, to paraphrase in a different context Herbert Crowley's comment from The Promise of American Life. He, of course, was talking about progressive legislation, but it still applies. Approval of the purchase and its subsequent financing marked the acceptance, even by those who had previously advocated a narrow interpretation of government powers, of the idea that the Constitution must be interpreted generously in order to allow the government to accomplish goals that might be in the national interest, but which required the exercise of power not expressly granted in that document. Even so, of course, that concept has never disappeared completely in American politics. The second constitutional debate sparked by Louisiana occurred when the Territory of Orleans, the present state of Louisiana minus the Florida parishes, applied for statehood after the 1810 United States Census revealed that it contained sufficient population to take that step. A question arose, however, from some Federalists who argued that it was not legal to admit a state to the Union that was carved from territory not part of the United States when it received its independence from Britain in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, or at the very least, that the state could not be admitted to the Union on a plane of equality with the states east of the Mississippi River. Vermont had already raised a version of this question when it applied for admission as the 14th state in 1791. The question then was whether or not a state could be added to the Union that had not been part of the original 13, which had won the Revolution. Vermont was admitted with equal status, however, in 1791, as were Kentucky in 1792, Tennessee in 1796, and Ohio in 1803. Then, here came the Territory of Orleans, not 1 square inch of which had ever been part of the British Empire. The Florida parishes, remember, which had been part of the British Empire, were not part of the territory at this time. Federalist Josiah Quincy of Massachusetts articulated this question in a lengthy address to the House of Representatives in January 1811. Quincy maintained that the preamble of the Constitution stated clearly that we, the people of the United States, had established the document. And, as he said, that there can certainly be nothing more obvious that than, from the general nature of the instrument, no power can result to diminish and give away to strangers any portion of the rights of the original partners, unquote. Quincy then raised the old Federalist concern about the fragility of the Constitution, first raised during the debate over the Purchase Treaty. This Constitution, he said, never was and never can be strained to lap over all the wilderness of the West without essentially affecting both the rights and convenience of its real proprietors. Emphasis on those last two words. Whenever it is attempted to be stretched over them, it will rend asunder, he said. His argument continued to be a curious line of thought that produced a concept of a delicate constitution in a party usually noted for its promotion of a vigorous constitution that endowed the federal government with significant power. Federalist argument was in reality more political than constitutional. Federalists were trying to prevent the addition of a state in the South and West that would properly strengthen the political power of the Democratic Republicans at their expense. George Poindexter, a territorial member of the House from Mississippi, answered Quincy by reminding him in congressional debate that Article 3 of the Treaty of Cession, by which the United States obtained Louisiana, required admission to the Union as soon as possible. And Poindexter also pointed out the treaty also says that the ceded territory shall be incorporated according to the principles of the federal Constitution to the enjoyment of all the rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens of the United States. Poindexter also observed that Quincy's threat of possible state secession over this issue, if followed by overt action, would amount to treason. Nevertheless, Quincy had raised an issue that had to be resolved. After considerable debate, Congress, dominated by a Democratic-Republican majority, decided that his argument had no merit and voted on January 14, 1811 for an enabling act, allowing the Territory of Orleans to write a constitution and create a state government. In this instance, a political decision answered a constitutional question. Thank you for your attention.